So, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening. I am Koel Banerjee, and it is an absolute pleasure to host you on behalf of Cultural Studies Forum, or CSRF. This is our baby, we can say. And for those of you tuning it for the first time, CSRF is a student led and non profit collective established in 2022. We operate on a simple but profound belief that knowledge has the power to transform. To bring this vision to life, we curate these public lectures, you can say, free public discussion, exploring everything from literature to fine arts to music and also food. Our goal is to spark curiosity, nurture critical thinking, and help students engage more deeply with the world we share. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to officially introduce our speaker for tonight. It is Debadrita Saha, ma'am. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Ashoka University. She holds a stellar academic foundation, having completed both her Bachelor in Arts, BA, and MA in English at Presidency University. Devadrita's research and teaching experiences make her uniquely equipped with, to guide us through today's complex topic, which is literature as witness, gendered violence from partition to the Naxalite uprising. She has previously designed and taught courses on partition literature to undergraduate students, and she has also taught invitational classes exploring partition and trauma in South Asian cinema. Her scholarly work deeply engages with the intersections of history, violence, and gender. She has published peer-reviewed research analyzing masculine hegemony and the partition in the works of Sadat Hassan Manto, and has presented extensively at international conferences on topics ranging from narratives of trauma and violence to gender based violence in South Asia. We are incredibly fortunate to have her today to share her insights on how literature captures and witness these difficult histories. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Devadita Shah. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Cole, for the warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give a lecture on this topic, which I know is still, every year, especially on 15th of August, we do relive at least one of these incidents, these violent incidents, and of course, discussing South Asia without talking about what happened in the Indian subcontinent, particularly these two movements, not movements per se, maybe. Let's say the two watershed moments of Indian history. I don't think that South Asian history can be complete, perhaps. And given that much of my work has been about pedagogy, particularly how college education can be transformed, I'm, I'm really interested in understanding how do we teach violence and South Asian literature, especially when it comes to teaching Indian students. And that's why my lecture today focuses on two perhaps oft discussed, but also sometimes misrepresented watershed events in the history of India. The partition of India in 1947 and the Naxalite movement, which started in the 1960s, but still continues in progress today. And so I hope my screen is visible to everyone. I do want to begin with something that happened 3 years after partition. Our writer sits in Lahore, a city he was first to migrate and a country he had not asked to inhabit, and publishes a short story about a Sikh man, yeah, or a Sikh man who had raped the corpse of a Muslim girl during the riots and is immediately charged with obscenity By the state, he has just become a citizen of, which is the modern day Pakistan, or the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. His defense when he eventually speaks in court is that if you find his stories dirty, the society you live in is dirty. In fact, Manto is quoted that this is famous quote that if you find my stories dirty, the society you live in is dirty. And that's a very cornerstone argument of his entire over of work, something that we need to keep in mind when we're discussing his works. And as you know, of course, the writer is Sadat Hassan Manto. The story is Thanda Gosht, meaning cold meat, or as Khalid Hassan translates it in English, cold with the ice. The translated text will be referred to here. And Manto was talking about a society was holding a mirror which had just killed approximately 1 million people and displaced between 10 and 20 billion more in the name of nation building. While official India on both sides of the new border was engaged in the urgent work of forgetting that any of these had happened. Amid the official India and Pakistan. 24 years later, a woman in Calcutta or Kolkata writes a novel about a mother who discovers that her son, a young revolutionary killed in a police encounter, does not appear by name in any newspaper. That he is not Brati Chatterjee, the son of a Hindu mother, but corpse number 1084. And that the erasure of his name from the public record is not incidental to the novel she is writing, but is in fact its entire argument. That woman is Mahasweta Devi, and what she is doing in Mother of 1084 as as I want to suggest, Manto is doing in Thanda Ghost. They are preserving in literary form exactly the testimony that official state discourse during those times worked very hard to eliminate. The human particular, the irreducible specific, the record of what actually happened to real people when history was being inscribed over their bodies and their lives. So, why this text? First of all, let's really talk about the new education policy that came into force since 2020 and what the University Grants Commission actually asks for. In fact, I think it might seem like institutional box taking at the surface, but I want to argue is a genuine intellectual point I want to make. When the national education policy was formulated, one of its stated principles was that education must develop not just cognitive capacity, but also, and I'm quoting the policy document here, social, ethical, and emotional capacities. The University Advanced Commission on Literacy, acting on that principle, has been revising its learning outcomes-based curriculum framework for English to explicitly include Indian writing, partition narratives, regional literature and translation, and subordinate and feminist perspectives as core areas that will optional supplements to just humanities courses. Manto appears in the implicit English syllabus under short story in the masters alongside Poe and Mansfield. Mahasadevi is taught in literature syllabi across the country, from Delhi University Services framework to the MA curricular institutions at institutions. Although it is quite interesting to note that one of our short stories dropped, but it was recently removed from the curriculum. And the reason why we can speculate is still not officially given. Now, why should you, a student, let's say undergraduate student, even a postgraduate student, care as much about these two takes that I'll be talking about? Maybe perhaps when a student of English literature, a student of South Asian literature can still care about it. They might have direct states, but what should the students of other disciplines actually care about? It's about a history student should care about this text or even this lecture at all. In fact, as I'm assuming, many of you might not be primary literature students, and even if you are, you do have other minors and you do work engaging interdisciplinary work. Some of you might be working with his political science or sociology, and they can make the case directly for why this text belong in your intellectual and research toolkit. Of course, as we all know, partition is not some kind of an ancient history. Scholarly consensus places a date for due partition at approximately 1 billion, with somewhere between 10 and 20 million people displaced, in what remains the largest post-migration recorded history. In fact, between 75,000 and 100,000 women were abducted amidst these turbulent times. The grandchildren of the people who survived the partition are alive today, descendants of the refugees too, perhaps. And many of your own families perhaps might carry this history in some form, often in silence, in what Vinadas calls quote unquote poisoned knowledge, things families knew but cannot speak. Violence has entered the ordinary fabric of life without ever being named. In fact, if you can, I'd highly suggest checking out the Partition Museum's work, the digital archive they are making, that they interview survivors. It is a brilliant archive and it really helps you while reading one. The Naxalite question is even more present tense, if you might say. The movement began in 1967 in a small village called Naxalbari in West Bengal, and it has still not ended. Alpa Shah's 2018 ethnography based on field work amongst active Maoist guerrilla fighters in central India, that is mostly in the fields of Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, estimates that over 10,000 alleged Naxalites and Maoists are currently imprisoned without trial. The problem of evasion. Relating the structural problem, both texts are responding to this work that Ganendra Pandey has described in his analysis of partition historiography. Official discourse does not merely fail to record political violence, but actively participates in suppression, framing what happened in 1947 as temporary madness, an aberration rather than the structural outcome of draconian colonial policy of divide and rule and communal mobilization. Sumanta Banerjee's authoritative history documents 1,784 Naxalites killed in West Bengal alone between 1970 and 1971, and notes that the West Bengal government, during that time it was the Communist Party of India, they stopped publishing casualty figures after that year, which is why, exactly why, the protagonist saw in Mother of 1980, in Mother of 1084, is not Brati Chatterjee in any official record, but reduced to a corpse number, Hajar Churashi, as it's called in Bengal here, 1084. Now, here's an ethical problem when writing about violence, something that even I also used to grapple with when I used to analyze this text, because violence can easily be sensationalized. You see it in media all the time, and with the rise of fake AI tools, fake videos can be created and used to spread violence. Like violent videos of violence can actually spread violence. And then when you're directly writing about violence as a literary author, the literature, how do you write about atrocity without turning it into a spectacle, without turning it into something that is to be sensationalized or injured? In fact, it is a genuine ethical difficulty in representing political violence that I want to make before we get to the texts themselves. Hannah Arendt, in is her work on violence, argues that violence can be justifiable in specific historical circumstances, but is never fully legitimate. It never earns the authority of being ethically right. Literary representation is a similar bind in that it can make that atrocity visible, of course, which is necessary. But it also risks stigmatizing that kind of a violence. It can turn for suffering into something consumable by the very nature of its creative neatness, which can then in turn become a form of exploitation. And we do know about how exploitative literature is a very popular genre nowadays because of course there is a market for it. So how do Manto and Mohashata Devi find formal solutions to this problem? And what we need to watch them navigate it. And that is part of what makes it text worth teaching, at least in a classroom space, a safe dialogic space. In fact, if you have any of you have read Manto or Devi before, please write down in the comments once I'm done speaking. I would really like to, see the comments and discuss with you more about your thoughts here. So partition, of course. On August 14th and 15th, 1947, British India was divided into two independent nation states along a boundary drawn in 5 weeks. Only 5 weeks by Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never set foot in India before the assignment and who left the country the day the borders were announced. Seems senseless, right? And before the violence began, and he reportedly burned his papers out of guilt or shame or fear, we don't know. The line cut through Punjab and Bengal, bisecting agricultural communities, urban neighborhoods, and family networks that had been integrated for generations. And the killing started immediately and on both sides, with trains crossing the border carrying corpses and villages being massacred, and approximately 1 million people dying in the process. Ritu Menon and Kamla versus meticulous research documents that women's bodies were systematically targeted in ways that understood the rape or killing of a woman of the other community, the other religious community. It's an act of territorial conquest. The Indian and Pakistani government subsequently passed the Abducted Persons Recovery and Restoration Act of 1949, which led to the forcible repatriation of approximately 83,000 women across the new border, often against their own wishes, and back to communities that did not want them. Mandaru Thandabush, 3 years after all of this, himself a Muslim who had migrated to Lahore under duress and left behind a Bombay film world where he had built his career, never fully reconciling himself to the migration, dying of alcoholism in 1955 at the age of 42. He had been tried twice before partition on obscenity charges and now was now well into his post-independence tally. 6 trials in total. And as Jalal, his niece and historian, who said, thrice before and thrice after the independence. And what all of these prosecutions had in common was a function of the obscenity charge as a way of refusing to discuss what his stories were actually about, the human content, that quote unquote ugly truth that nobody wanted to lose. So let's cut to the Naxalite movement, which has been running from 1960 plus. In May 1967, and in Naxalbari village in the Darjeeling district of West Bengal, police fired on a group of tribal peasants who were resisting a landlord's attempt to seize their harvest. In May 1967, in Naxalbari village in the Darjeeling district of West Bengal, police fired on a group of tribal peasants who were resisting a landlord's attempt to seize their harvest, killing 9 people, including 6 women and 2 children. And this event triggered what became known as the Naxalite movement, a communist revolutionary uprising drawing initially on Maoist ideology, the ideology of Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, and demanding land redistribution and the end of freedom exploitation. By 1970, the movement had spread to Calcutta and was recruiting heavily from exact the social class one might least expect. Rabindra Rees, who was a former Naxal himself, research shows that approximately 70% of the urban Naxalites came from college-educated backgrounds with a median age of 19 to 24. Brati Chatterjee, the son of a Calcutta-based affluent chartered accountant, was drawn into revolutionary politics by genuine moral conviction about inequality, about systemic inequality. And he's an entirely typical figure, an entirely typical face of the Naxalite politics of the time, but no, and not an exceptional one. The state's response to such uprising was systematic and brutal in ways that Sumanta Banerjee's historical documents carefully. What were officially called encounter killings, extrajudicial, that is, extrajudicial executions, plus armed confrontations, became a standard practice with 1,784 Naxalites killed in West Bengal between 1970 and 1971. Though the true number is almost certainly higher because families were often unable to claim bodies and the government stopped publishing figures and newspapers self-censored under informal pressure And then under formal censorship during the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi after 1975. Devi was writing Mother of 1084 in 1974 in the middle of this, with access to testimony, to families, with a particular texture of official silence. And her novel is built on documentary knowledge of what was actually happening. The reason it makes sense to read these two texts together beyond their geographical proximity is that both moments are both events in history share a structural logic. In both of the states, we see violence is systematic and the official narratives are suppressing what really happened. And in both cases, literature becomes, or maybe perhaps fiction, becomes one of the only spaces where real testimony can survive. And this cannot be framed as a coincidence, but it is rather a very poignant and a very forceful argument for the real purpose of literature. It is not just for entertainment or unthinking entertainment, it does have a political value to it. It's a short story, and I think most of us have read Kanda Ghost in some form or the other. And it's I every time you read the story, even though you know the narrative, the experience of not knowing what is coming really matters. It has such a shock value to it. But let me walk you through the structure. The story opens at night with Ishwar Singh returning from the communal riots to Kalwan's court. And what the narrative establishes before any confession or explanation is the failure of his body. The way the violence he has participated in has unmanned him, rendered him impotent so completely that he cannot touch his partner, cannot account for the paralysis in his body, cannot find a language adequate to express what he has done or tried to do. Over the course of the night, he confesses to Kalwan that during the riots he had carried a young Muslim girl away from a massacre, intending to assault her, but when he finally acts on his desires, he discovers that she is already dead. And the horror of that revelation undoes him entirely. Kalwan, hearing the confession, slashes his throat. But again, he has not fully heard it. He just partly hears his confession and she immediately slashes his throat. The story ends with her placing her hand on this and finding it cold with the knife. But he has become, in the story's final image, exactly what he has violated. Manta was charged with obscenity for the story in 1915. In each case of this obscenity trials, the charge of obscenity functioned as a way of refusing to discuss what the story was actually about. The crucial passage here in the story is Ishwar confession, and I'm reading it out from Kanumasan's translation. I thought she had gone into a field, so I carried her over my shoulder all the way to the actual, all the way to the camp. Then I laid her down on the grass behind some bushes. First, I thought I'd shuffle her a bit, but then I decided to trunk her right up. His voice sank. Three things are worth slowing down. First of all, the ellipses are very deliberate stylistic choices here. They're doing very crucial work. In fact, you do not see just that those ellipses as kind of empty spaces, but they are very heavy, pregnant pauses. And those are the places where the violence lives, but what it cannot articulate. And Manto does not describe the assault completely in very gory details, but describes everything around it. The carrying of the girl, the grass, the bushes. So the assault itself becomes a silence between the phrases. In fact, do not just mistake this ellipse as a kind of, just mere stylistic decoration, but treat them as a kind of testimony where silence, with the absence of detail, is the evidence. Next is the metaphor of the card playing. The words shuffle and trumps are very important and they're borrowed from card games, of course, as we know. And Manto is showing us how each person's vocabulary works, how his own system of his lexicon works here. He cannot name the act directly. And so he converts it into a game with rules. But the metaphor immediately breaks down because it cannot trump the corpse. It cannot outrun it. It cannot outperform the corpse. And the rules of the game do not apply clearly anymore. And that's when his language fades at exactly the same moment that his masculinity fades. What Sarah Ahmed calls the structuring of violence, the formation of human community, the logic that says that women's bodies are territorial borders and violating claims of territorial conquest collapses when the woman is already dead. Manda refuses to give us a graphic description of the assault. He refuses to give the Muslim word in interiority and he refuses to make Ishwar a sympathetic character. And these are not failures of the text of ethical choices, but weaknesses. To describe the assault graphically would be to us to criticize her. To give her interiority would be to give the corpse an interiority would be to claim a knowledge that Mando does not have and cannot earn. To make Ishwar sympathetic would be to explain away, justify in a way what he did. These refusals are the ethics at the core of the story, and the story's subversive potential lies precisely in how the dead girl's coldness ultimately destroys her attacker, her perpetrator. That her silence is not a passivity. Of course, it's biological passivity in a way. But even then, her deadness becomes a refusal to be assimilated into the hegemonic narrative of the masculinist triumphant nation. In fact, I had a question for you, and I would love to discuss this in the Q&A session. Manto just put the word thunder in the title, in the confusion, in the final image where Kalwan places a thunder eastward. So and fires it colder than ice. I mean, what do you think? Who or what is actually cold by the wind? What is the significance of this word cold? Why is it so important? Of course, like ghost and you recurred with the word ghost and how in some translations why that word ghost is omitted. We switch to Mother of Wands in the eighth from here. And yeah, the gap is kind of worth noting to some extent. Hadar Churashin Ma was published in Bengali in 1974 and the title translates as Mother of Wands in the eighth floor, the number being a police mark registration number. Shamik Bandyopadhyay's English translation was published by Seagull Books in Calcutta in 1997. The entire novel takes place in a single day, very much like the Thunder Ghost short story on January 17th, the anniversary of Rati's death, and also crucially, the date of his sister Kuli's engagement. A fact that Devi establishes of the novels very openly. That the house is preparing for a celebration at the same moment that Sujata Chatterjee, the wife of a Calcutta-based upper-class affluent Brahmin man, is the only person in that amidst the celebration who cannot partake in it. The gap between the family's performance of normalcy and what she knows, what the mother knows, is not an incidental part of the novel, but the condition of possibility for everything that happens in it. The layering of festivity over grief as a kind of a blanket solution is a novel's central image of middle class and upper middle class complicity into status violence made very concrete and domestic, and it is worth ensuring that you notice it from the very first discussion of the novel. Sujata, a middle-aged mother, has four children, and her son Vrati, we learn, has been killed in a police encounter sometime before the novel's opening. Deepika also crucially mentioned that Sujata is a menopausal mother, which kind of makes her a redundant figure in a family which treats women purely as reproductive vessels. Still, she has never been told the truth of how or why her youngest son died, what he believed in, who he was in the world outside their home. The novel is a story of what this mother discovers in the course of one day that Vrati was a Noxalite corpse number 1084 and that her entire family participated willingly or through complicity in erasing him from existence. In fact, After the publication of this novel, Devi told Bangla Academy in 1997 that she wrote such stories, and most of you have read Draupadi, because she says, quote, I'm haunted by human suffering, unquote. And the novel is rooted in that haunting. In a particular pretty crucial juncture of the novel, which is very early, but that's something kind of like, gives you a foreboding about what is about to happen. There is a passage, what I call the newspaper passage, where this very the first starts suspecting that her son Rati might have had a dual identity, but so does her husband. A husband who does not act like the typical father. Tipunath had succeeded in his mission, his wire proving. Next, the newspapers reported deaths of four young men. Their names were reported. Rati was not mentioned in any of the reports. Diponath, the father, Shweta's husband, uses his social connections to keep his son's name out of the newspapers, not to protect Rati's legacy, but to protect his own reputation. So at the newspaper, the official record of the first draft of history erases Rati twice. Once by the state, which prefers its victims to be anonymous, and once by his own father. This precise structure edition that Pandey identifies in his analysis of partition historiography, but official discourse does not merely fail to record values but actively participates in suppression. Davies' novel exists to undo this, and this is what I mean by a counter archive. Not Pop's number 1684, but Bhuti Chatterjee, who loved Nandini, who argued with his father, who chose revolution over comfort, and a novel gives him back his particularity precisely because he mystical uniform. Walter Benjamin's critique of violence distinguishes between lawmaking violence, which founds new orders, and law preserving violence, which maintains existing structures to force. The encounter killings, the censorship, the erasure of mainstream newspapers are all law preserving violence in this sense, maintaining an unjust order by making its victims disappear. The novel refuses to resolve that tension between revolutionary confusion and its human cause, and that refusal is its honesty. Here is an objection I've often heard from my students when I'm discussing the text with them. Sujata seems passive for most of the novel. She's just simply watching in horror and feeling helpless. She simply cannot understand why her son would participate in such a revolutionary uprising. And so the question might be, by focusing the novel on the mother and not the victim, is Devi simply reproducing the structure she claims to critique? Now, here's the thing, Sujata's passivity is Devi's subject and not her failure, because the novel anatomizes how middle class patriarchal structures, early marriage of women, economic dependence, the obligation and social propriety produce passivity in women like Sujata in ways that made authentic communication between her and her son Brati fundamentally impossible. Brati told his lover, Nandini, who was also his comrade in arms, everything about their sheer hope for revolution of a just society. He could tell his mother nothing because his mother was inside and unconsciously complicit within the structure he was fighting against. Because Srila Roy's research on gender and Naxalite movement documents this dynamic directly. The masculine coded nature of revolutionary politics also meant that women in Naxalite families, especially mothers, were often structurally positioned as an embodiment of everything the movement was rejecting, even when they had no political power whatsoever. The mother figure kind of became the easy scapegoat past these revolutionaries who, when they could not blame the father figure, the patronym, the name of the father, would find the mother figure as an easy target. That were you being complicit? How can you as a mother not understand our plight? What happens is Sujata in the course of the novel is not redemption in simple sense, but awakening. She defies her husband Dibona for the first time. She visits the family of another victim, Rati's friend, but a person who is from a working class background, Shonu. in the slum colony or the basti. She crosses class lines that should have never crossed before. And at the end of the novel, her heart-rending cry, which Davies describes as something that, quote, burst, exploded like a massive question spread through all the houses in the city, unquote. It's not grief in any ordinary sense, but a refusal of forgetting the violence, and it is the loudest theme in the novel. In fact, here are four things that both the novels do. First, they refuse spectacle. Margaret does not describe the assault, and David does not describe the encounter killing. And both texts locate their moral weight in consequence and psychological rapture, rather than in the act of violence itself. But the girl's coldness matters more than the moment of violence, and the mother's cry matters more than the encounter. In fact, you don't see this as a kind of squeamishness on the part of the writer, kind of deliberate withdrawal or fear to, kind of express yourself. It's not self censorship. It's a formal choice about what the ethical weight should fall. Second, as you can see, gender is the main analytical and ethical axis here. In Martha, the feminized body is the site where the logic of partition violence is exposed and then fails. And in Devi, the structures of patriarchy that produce compliant mothers are shown to be inseparable from the structures of class inequality that produce revolutionary sons or children. And neither is incidentally about gender, but both essentially about it. Marco is writing about communal complicity, what entire communities committed to happen in 1947 and silently witnessed. And Devi is writing about middle class complicity, the Bengali Bhadralok or the gentleman, who, as B.P. Chakravarti has documented, fought from cultural radicalism while materially supporting state values. In other words, in their art, in their literature, they could be, very revolutionary. But when it came to actually protesting against what the state was doing, they became suddenly silent. All of their revolution was kind of armchair performative or even quoted ivory tower. So that the audience for football that does revolutionary theater was often the same class that enabled people like Vipona or even like police like Saroj Paul, who would often torture the Naxalite victims in jail. The ellipsis in fourth formal innovation is epistemological. The ellipsis in Manto, the one-day compression of the narrative in Devi, the card play euphemism, the palimpsest of voices in Mother of Ones in the Age for which is a very stream of consciousness novel to some extent. So epistemological devices, ways of representing violence without conferring authority on it. And when you study this space, you should pay attention to form as carefully as you pay attention to content because the two are not inseparable. Let me come back to where I started. Manto in Lahore in 1950 writing limited date for that official Indian, official Pakistan court wanted to forget. Devi is in Calcutta in 1974 writing about a young man whose own father had his name removed from the newspaper. What literature does in both cases is to restrict particularly what ideology renders abstractly. So it partitions 1 million dead because issue was in specific following a specific field beside a specific channel. And the Naxalite problem because Sujata's irrepressible laws and corpse number 108 becomes a human being. Prati, an ordinary son, a revolutionary youth with hopes of changing the society. That act of particularization is very political because it challenges the pretense of norms that allows violence to continue without being linked. And it's a challenge that both writers sustain not through argument or being directly polemical, but through form, the texture of the language they work on, Marco in Urdu, and also Devi in Bengali, but also the question of the translators also have to render it as faithful as possible. It's a double act of, ethical representation that is happening. Everything the text refuses to be as much as true what it does. Near the end of Mother of 108 for Nandini, who actually, eh, gives here to the first kind of political consciousness, whose diffidence, whose resistance actually makes her to understand what she has to do, what her first step should be. She says, and Nandini is a woman who has been blinded in police custody. She was not killed because she was a woman, but she was left all semi-paralyzed, blinded for life. And Nandini says, even in that state, nothing is quietened down. It can't. What does nothing mean? What cannot quieten down? It is a political situation, of course. But she can equally be describing this literary text which we are discussing here, which go on asking of every reader about violence in your own moment, in its unwitnessed, but stories you continue not to tell. And that's why you have a Chumpa Lahiri who comes up with Lowland, perhaps. It's not one of our most famous ones, but quite a faithful account, perhaps, of what is really happening. So my key takes, I've not given the entire bibliography, but I'm happy to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Devadrita, for such a profound and evocative session. As someone who belongs to Bengal, like me and you, hearing you navigate these specific historical traumas from the displacement and ruptures of partition to the political upheaval of the Naxalite era, it actually feels deeply resonant and necessary. And also on this occasion where the so-called election is going on, we can totally connect to that. And your analysis of how literature captures the gendered wound, quote unquote, of our history reminds us that these stories are far more than just archival records. Whether you were discussing the failures of masculine hegemony in Manto's narratives, or the interrogation of motherhood and survival during the 1943 Bengal famine, you have shown us that literature provides a unique space for these voices of those who often push to the margins. Okay, so for those of us rooted in this landscape, I mean, not only Bengal, but wherever we are, uh, your insights help us understand how these narratives act as a vital form of memory keeping, and it is actually honoring a resilience that survived even when the official history remained silent. And nowadays it is happening actually. So thank you for your provocative talk. If
Thank
anyone
you so
has any
much.
query, please feel free to ask to Debadrita, or you can just use the chat box. And whoever was watching us on YouTube, please send me the query. I will just forward you. Anyone? Not necessarily it will be a query. You can also speak like we are chatting. And one more thing, you had a question, right? In that slide. I have the slide with me because I took the screenshot. And
Okay, yeah,
yeah. And it was the question like Mantu puts the word cold in the title,
yeah,
in the confession, and in the final image, where Kalvant places her hand on Ishwar and finds it colder than ice. So who or what is cold by the end? What is that word carrying? This is your question for discussion.
yeah,
So I mean, I am also a fan of Manto. I chose to read Thanda Ghost when I am actually in a depression. Okay. I went through a depression a few years back, but I thought to read that one. And from this question, I got that the word cold is not merely a descriptor. description of temperature. It is an ontological state that marks the absolute collapse of the human spirit. This is my way of
Absolutely.
thinking. Yeah.
The
And it
numbness,
is
like
the cold, yeah, it is the cold meat of the young girl Ishwar Singh attempted to violate. He attempted to violate the cold meat. I mean, the quote unquote, in the text we find that word. And her deathly chill acts as the final silent resistance that shocks the predator out of the violent turns. I mean, I don't know how I can expressing this thing, but it shook me when I got into that character. If we got into that character, it shook me. That's the thing.
yeah, the thing is that first of all, I know at a surface level, we might think that a Thanda ghost is basically the dead girl's body, which is being talked about because Ishwar Singh frequently uses the word me to describe women's bodies. But then because it's a story about sexuality as well and about sexual intercourse, we also said he actually becomes a Thanda ghost himself, and that is the irony. Like, so much of his virility comes from being able to conquer women, to be able to trump women. But then he becomes that coldness, it's a coldness that is so much weird. And I think that is also Mantel's challenge towards us readers. And are you also cold people? That is the story making you feel cold? If so, then there is something that definitely needs to be challenged. It is definitely wrong with you. It should actually make you question that why is it making me cold? Or was I already cold? Was I already passive? Coldness for me here, I think it translates to passivity, kind of so. The passive and the horror that completely numbs you, that traumatizes you. But of course, I'd love to hear other perspectives as well. And especially anything on the Naxalite uh, violence as well. If anybody has anything to ask, I'd be happy to answer.
True. And also, the cold, this word means, I mean, this word carries the weight of partition's moral failure.
Exactly.
It is suggesting that the communal violence intended to assert one identity over another resulted only in a hollow, frozen, and where humanity itself has been extinguished. This is the word, I mean, the cold. It actually carrying a many things. So Manto put it very, I mean, in an intelligent way.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
The choice of his words. I mean, Kholdo, if you remember the Kholdo short story. I mean, you never would understand at what
true.
actually Kholdo means until and unless you go to the very end of it. So yeah, it kind of got
There
us
is
like a
many.
yeah, like at a surface level, it might feel like a shock tactic, but it's not just when he's writing at a time when he's trying to basically incite people into actually feeling it that something is wrong with you if you're thinking of it only as obscene as not as something that's rotted at the in the state of Denmark of sorts. And so is for Devi, I guess. Like Devi's title of the story, short story, Draupadi, for instance. Draupadi for us has that kind of Mahabharata church, the woman. And when we think of Draupadi, for instance, we immediately think of the Vastra Haran scene, when her clothes were being taken away from her. At the very end of the story, like Manto, Devi also ends with that shocking scene. And there we understand how Draupadi's name becomes ironically her. So is mother of 1084. That is a mother of a police mob number.
Okay,
Right.
there is a question from our YouTube listener. She asked this question. I'm just going to read it because it's a virtual platform, right? So much of the violence during partition and the Naxalite movement was met with familial or state enforced silence. How does a writer witness something that was never spoken aloud? And what role does the imagination play in filling those historical silences?
Thank you to the unnamed listener. That's actually a very good question to ask, and something that I have been grappling with when I have been teaching violence in South Asian literature. Because of course we have to remember that these two writers were actually situated within the violence or the violent state when they were writing about. Manto was direct actually one of the victims who directly witnessed what was happening. In fact, Manto does himself talk about in his own writings that what he wrote about was directly he actually kind of like taken from what he witnessed around himself and when what he discussed with his friends. Very similar for Devi, whose own son was a Naxalite, Naxalite revolutionary for a significant part of his life, Nabaram Bhattacharya. And Devi herself felt that what if my son were to face a very similar fate like this other youth were facing? And she writes from that kind of a human perspective. Of course, part of it is indeed imagination. And as you italicized it, like how Manto writes about that what Ishwar Singh would have possibly done with a Muslim girl and the question of her being caught. It is definitely a genius stroke of imagination or of Sujata's sudden kind of a awakening, which is almost like a very Greek Sophoclean Greek tragedy sort of kind of exposing, kind of revelation of what is about to happen. I think since official documents and history does erase this very troubling, very discomforting kind of knobs in history, human imagination, by actually trying to understand what is going on, by actually trying to understand the psyche of the perpetrator and the perpetrated, the oppressor and the oppressed, can actually help us realize that there is more to the representation of an event than just, official documents. In fact, as I already mentioned, and sorry for being a bit reiterative about the point, since Manto and Devi are actually kind of survivors of these two particular watershed moments in history, their experiences can be called somewhat kind of a fictionalization of a lived experience. And I know often how lived experiences sometimes now often discredited as something not very authentic or or kind of what to say very kind of sensationalized or very hyperbolic. But then again, you have to sometimes remember that when they were living with the censored times, channeling their lived experience into fiction was one of the deliberate choices they could make in order to actually question the state. They were writing in censorship states. And even within that, the fact that Manto was actually questioned, in fact, for Thanda Ghosh, there was this Lahore policeman who said that who basically did not understand the point of Thanda Ghosh. He was Lahore-based policeman told Manto that this guy, you have made our Muslim girls so degenerate, you have dishonored the Muslim community. And that is where it comes out. That is where this whole state facade is being exposed. That the state does not even understand the point of structural, gendered, and cultural class inequalities. It is simply so obsessed with the question of honor and particularly gendered honor that it is so myopic towards the plight of its own people. And that is why such politically conscious writers with their imagination, by questioning the state, by repeatedly getting into a tussle with the state, fill up those gaps. They make us question, they make us go into the deep investigation down the rabbit hole into seeing that what is actually the real truth, the real history. That just a majoritarian history is not only the history that we should be studying. There are multiple perspectives to a history or histories, and maybe it sometimes might be her story as well. Thank you. I hope I could partly answer at least your question.
Thank you, Debadrita. One more question from another of our students. He's the Bhalat student. He asked that in many of the narratives you discussed, the figure of the mother is often used to represent the nation, Bharat Mata. Does this symbolism help us understand gendered violence better, or does it actually hide the real individual suffering of women behind a metaphor?
Thank you. Another interesting question. In fact, I think no discussion of partition and even state India's history should be complete with a discussion of the iconography of the Bharat Mata. Now, if we know about the genealogy of the Bharat Mata, which came, the painting that actually cemented the idea of Bharat Mata, as you know, like India as a nation, comes from two different texts. One is Bankim Chandra's Anandamot, the Vande Mataram, where mother becomes the Sujalam Supalam, the verdant, the green, the cherished land. The land becomes feminized and synonymous with the mother, who is supposed to protect the children. And secondly, Abanindranath Tagore, the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, he painted a portrait of the Bharat Mata, four hands, and dressed in saffron clothes, a cloth the color of sacrifice, in a very ascetic kind of a way. Now, when you have such an iconography of the sacrificial, the self abnegating, the self destructive kind of a mother who is only suffering, who does not complain, who is very passive, somewhat like Sujata, you do have to understand that people who actually uncritically absorb this image, oh, that my land is my mother, they think that it is their duty to save their land by fighting against people who might be quote unquote raping their land. The land becomes the site of all their masculinized combats and armed struggles, and basically it is just another way of showing their own frustrated masculinities. Now, does that mean that I'm not saying that you should defend your land when you have to? Of course you should. What my question is, as you rightly pointed out, that it has a real individual suffering of women behind the metaphor. So I think the iconography, although for me it's quite redundant, and I know it can sound controversial, I think we need to understand genealogy behind it. Who created the metaphor? We did not get a woman's opinion when the symbolism of the Bharat Mata was being created. It is men who made the land into a mother. And if you might know, Nazi Germany thought of the land to be a fatherland. In fact, M.S. Golwalkar, in this book, his semi-autobiographical work, where he talks about the foundation of the RSS, he says that the land should not be the motherland, the land should be a fatherland. Only then the land will become strong. Golwalkar thinks that the problem of the land is that we have feminized it. The land needs to be like the Nazi Germany, the fatherland. That, that's when it will become strong. So we do understand then perhaps that the land just becomes synonymous with a tokenistic kind of ideological warfare. And of course, women again figure nowhere here except when it is to serve the interest of the men who form the policies, men who go to fight. And so, yeah, it's all a metaphor that helps to serve narrow in masculinist patriarchal interests without actually thinking about that gender which it is supposed to respect or honor at least. I hope that helps.
It is. It works actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, Aditra Shrinish, if you have anything to say, please unmute yourself.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible, Aditya.
Yeah, so I was wondering what the material solution would be to conflicts such as these. You mentioned the Naxal conflict. Obviously, there are a lot of issues and it's a complex topic. And like you mentioned, the identity of a woman is often used to describe or exaggerate and even make people active in their ideological warfare and stuff. So, what is the material solution to it? Right now, we are in the process of educating ourselves to counter narratives that are, trying to uh, uh, bring society to a certain extreme. So I was wondering, materially, how would we change this for the better?
One thing I would actually say, but that will not go down very well with most people, is basically tax the rich. Like actually tax the rich. In fact, and bring about a drama, kind of concrete overhaul to the state policies which are actively favoring corporations. Is something. In fact, if you think of the Naxalite movement, the origin of it was the question about land redistribution. Tribal peasants were being disenfranchised. They were not allowed to have ownership over the land which they had been allowed to till. They were part of a feudalistic system. And in the present day India and across the world, we see a kind of techno-feudalism going on, where common people's rights are being draconianly suppressed. So first of it is to ensure that the our constitution is a very solid book. It's a really good guideline. The problem is we do not really follow it in practice. We do not have freedom of speech in the first place, and we do not state policies, even though they are meant to actually uphold equality of all. To some extent, it does favor a certain group of techno feudalists, of technocrats, and nobody is questioning that. So maybe my first step is first of all tax the rich, make them accountable, and actually bring about a complete end to corruption. But I know, of course, like these are all kind of wishful thinking at some point. And in fact, this is a question not just you, but many of my students ask me, like, what is the material solution? And I'm like, maybe start asking questions within your own family, perhaps. I mean, something that we all have to do, like Sujata, for instance, who starts questioning her own husband. Why did you actually suppress your own son's death? Why did you think that your career was more important than your own son? Small things like, like basically charity begins at home, basically, questioning ourselves and starting to bring about a change in our own. And actually, maybe even questioning the state when it is trying to silence you. That should be one of the first material solution that you can actively try to take. But of course, you need the freedom of speech for that. And given the rise of censorship, I don't know if you can really have a complete material solution. In fact, I'm glad that elections are still here. And that is one of the few avenues we have to bring about a better state, have a better state. But yeah, we don't know much.
So I guess we're in a very pessimistic state at the moment, aren't we?
I mean, it is pessimistic. I would, the state is certainly being very optimistic about its policies, but yeah, the conditions are certainly pessimistic. The GDP is at an all-time low. Even Pakistan ranks higher, if that is our big concern. So, yeah,
Thank you, ma'am.
thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Aditya, for your query. And with this, we are about to end today's session. Okay. So, thank you, everyone, as we bring this session to a close. And I have the honor of proposing the vote of thanks. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Devadita Saha ma'am. Uh, your insight into how literature acts as a witness to gendered violence, from the trauma of partition to the complexities of the Naxalite uprising, it has been incredibly moving and thought provoking. And your expertise, drawing from your research on figures like Manto or Mahashwata Devi and your work at Ashoka University, provided us with a much deeper understanding of these historical narratives. And last but not the least, to our audience, thank you for the presence and your engaging questions. Your participation is what makes this discussion so meaningful and keeps the spirit of critical inquiry alive at our Cultural Studies Research Forum. Finally, thank you to everyone who worked behind the scene to make this webinar run smoothly. We look forward to seeing you all at our next lecture as well. Till then, be with Valat and do your best. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you for organizing this so smoothly. I'm really glad and for the wonderful questions. It's a
Thank,
really lovely session with you all. Thank
thank you. And Devadita ma'am, I have a request. If you kindly share the PPT with me, then I can post it in our CSRF group. There is a
you. Sure.
Telegram group. It is for public, of course. So I will post it there if you allow only.
Absolutely. I will share with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.